Okay, welcome everybody again. So this session will be chaired by Paul Alexander Corillo Maldonado. I hope that I pronounced it correctly. Who is an engineer in economic and financial sciences from the National Polytechnic School in Ecuador. He holds a BA of economics from the Jean Monnet University in France. He's currently a PhD candidate in development economics at Flasco, Ecuador. He has worked at the Central Bank of Ecuador and at other important public institutions of Ecuador. He also worked at Inter-American Development Bank and Economic Commission for Latin American and Caribbean. His fields of interest are macroeconomics, economic policy, distribution, econometrics, time series, and his PhD dissertation is on Kaleckian relationships between functional distribution and growth in Latin American countries. So please welcome Paul. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Some announcements to start. I remember you to remain mute. I remember you to wait on the end to ask questions. So then I have to honor to present Eckhard Hein, who is professor of the economics at the Berlin School of Economics and Law, the co-editor of the Institute for International Political Economics Berlin, a member of the Coordination Committee for the Forum for Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policies, and managing co-editor of the European Journal of the Economics and Economics Policy Interventions. He has published widely in referendum academic journals such as Cambridge Journal of Economics, Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, Macroeconomica, Review of the Keynesian Economics, Review of the International Political Economy, and Review of the Political Economy, among several others. Among his last books are the German Financial System and the Financial and Economic Crisis, was published by Springer International, Distribution and Growth After the Keynes, and Post-Keynesian Guide was published by Edward Elgars. The Macroeconomics of Financial Dominate Capitalism and its Crisis, was published by Edward Elgar. There is your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you also to Louis-Philippe and Gracian and Marcin for organizing this conference. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to speak here because, well, I've benefited a whole lot from Kalecki's work and in particular from the first and second generation Kaleckian models, which Robert has reviewed and have tried a bit to contribute. And I don't know, Robert, to the third or fourth or fifth generation, including money, interest, finance, and so on into these models. But today I was asked for this conference to present something on Kalecki and economic policy. And therefore I've chosen a topic and I've tried to share my screen. Well, I've chosen, now I can't, I have to change something here. How can I do that? Okay. I have chosen as a topic to talk about the Eurozone in crisis, a Kaleckian macroeconomic regime and policy perspective. And that's based on a paper which I've done with a young graduate student of mine, Judith Marcin. I don't know whether she has joined us by now.
Eckhard, maybe you can click on full screen view, then we'll be.
Okay, sorry, I have
convenient. Yeah, on the bottom, right.
Yeah. Okay, now it's better. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So what we try to do here is to, well, link several areas of research, so the research on macroeconomic regimes, which we've done in the context of financialization research. We go a bit back to Kalecki and then try to draw some conclusions for European economic policy making. I have to make a similar disclaimer as Malcolm Sawyer did, so I'm not sure whether I'm saying anything new. And furthermore, as you will see, there will be a bit of an overlap with what Malcolm has presented, and I beg your pardon for this in advance. Now, if we look at the current situation of in the Eurozone, we find that the Eurozone as a whole has been hit by the COVID-19 crisis, as many other areas in the world economy, but it has been hit asymmetrically. So Germany, of course, also facing a severe crisis, has been hit less than, for instance, Spain, Italy, and even France. And this crisis has hit the Eurozone in a difficult period of an insufficient recovery from the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, and then the Eurozone crisis starting in 2010. The latter crisis has, well, all these crises, I would argue, have made clear that there are severe problems in economic policy institutions and in the economic policy model of the Eurozone, which is to a large extent based on new consensus macroeconomics, as Philip Orestes and Malcolm Sawyer have explained many, many years ago. And so in this crisis, in these crises, it has become clear that in normal times, there is no mechanism in the Eurozone that prevent rising current account imbalances and divergent development among member states. It has become clear that in a deep recession, the only macroeconomic policy tool, the interest rate set by the ECB, is insufficient to stabilize aggregate demand and economic activity. And most importantly, I would argue, and that is, in my view, the main reason why these crises have turned towards a Eurozone crisis, the role of the ECB as a lender of last resort, in particular for member state governments, had been unclear at the beginning of the crisis and has only partly been remedied since then. Interestingly so, the initial response towards the COVID-19 crisis have been quite expansionary. So if you look at fiscal policies, the strict budgetary rules included in the Stability and Growth Pact and the further developments have been temporarily suspended. We see a fiscal expansion of 3.5% EU GDP and also large liquidity guarantees by national governments in particular. New assistance schemes have been developed, for instance, the EU funding for short-term work scheme, and existing institutions have been targeted towards fighting the crisis, although, of course, after long struggles and discussions between the different groups of member countries in the Eurozone. The latest development is the recovery plan presented by the European Commission, which is financed by debt issued by the European Commission itself. The ECB has remained expansionary in this crisis with several measures. I don't have time to go into all the details. So that the macroeconomic policy stance, if you like, in this deep crisis is quite expansionary. However, the question is whether this means a change in the long run macroeconomic policy attitude or stance, or whether this is just a short run and ad hoc response towards a deep crisis. Personally, I'm quite skeptical. And therefore, it is, I think, still at stake to discuss an alternative macroeconomic policy model for the Eurozone with a focus in particular on fiscal policies beyond the short run as it is applied currently. And for that purpose, in the current paper and in this presentation, we are going back to the work of Michael Kalecki from the mid-1940s, the first half of the 1940s, and we look at how this work has been further developed by modern post-Keynesians in order to present an alternative to the current macroeconomic policy model which has dominated at least the Eurozone and the EU till this COVID-19 crisis. So the structure of the paper and also the presentation is as follows. So first we look a bit at the demand and growth regimes in the Eurozone, applying a tool and an approach which we have developed several years ago in the context of our research on financialization. We look at how these regimes have changed after the 2007-2009 crisis and then the Eurozone crisis starting in 2010. Then we go back to Kalecki, and there you will see a lot of overlap with what Malcolm Sawyer has already presented. Look at Kalecki's economic policy suggestions for achieving and maintaining full employment. And then in the last step, we develop that towards a Kaleckian post-Keynesian policy mix for the Eurozone. Let us start with the demand and growth regimes under the conditions of finance-dominated capitalism, as I've called it. And I don't have much time to go into the details, but I have presented this at several conferences and published about that in several papers and also in the book. If we look at it, so the macroeconomics of this latest development of capitalism since the 1980s is, from my perspective, characterized by four main developments or channels to which financialization has an impact on the macroeconomy. First, it's income distribution, so a rising inequality, fall in wage shares, rise in profit shares. It is through a depressive effect on investment in the capital stock. At least in some countries, it has facilitated a deficit finance, credit finance consumption up to the 2007-2009 crisis. And it has contributed to the buildup of global and also regional current account imbalances. So countries running high current account surpluses on the one hand and countries running high deficits on the other hand. In this context, we have distinguished four macroeconomic regimes. So the debt-led private demand boom regime, the export-led mercantilist regime, and then in between a weakly export-led regime and a domestic demand regime. And in our empirical research, we've tried to cluster the countries looking at only two types of indicators. The first one is the financial balances of the main sectors of our macroeconomy, and the second is the growth contributions. And you find this table here. I don't have much time to go into the details, but the important characteristics of each regime you find here in circles. So for the export-led mercantilist regime, we have high growth contributions of the balance of goods and services, and we have financial deficits of the external sector, which means current account surpluses. In a sense, we have rising current account surpluses in this period. And on the opposite side, in the debt-led private demand boom regime, we have high growth contributions of domestic demand, in particular consumption demand, and we see financial deficits of the private sector and in particular of the private household sector. So this has been the constellation which has led us into the crisis. And for the Eurozone, this has meant that we have seen rising current account imbalances within the Eurozone since it started in 1999. We're starting here in 2001 because we include Greece and the core or the main Eurozone countries so we see these rising current account imbalances. We know then the crisis hit, and we have seen on the one hand the need for rebalancing, the need for deleveraging of the private sector, and on the other hand, we have seen that with the start of the Eurozone crisis, we have seen a turn towards austerity policies, which then has led to another recession in the core Eurozone in 2012-2013. In total, we have seen a weak recovery of the Eurozone, even weaker than the worldwide recovery, even weaker than the recovery, maybe I just move here, weaker than the recovery in the US or in other non-Eurozone EU countries. Great Britain was still, the United Kingdom was still a member, or is still a member. Which in general has against the background of this weak global recovery has led to this debate about sectoral stagnation. And in the Eurozone, it has been even weaker. This recovery has been asymmetric, so Germany has recovered faster than the periphery. We have seen as a further element that we had weak growth contributions, in particular of investment, which had been modest already in the period 2001-2009. We have seen another feature of finance-dominated capitalism, that financial balances of corporate sectors turned positive in all the countries we are examining here. So this type of weak recovery in the period 2010 to 2019 has meant a shift of regimes within the Eurozone, a shift of regimes towards export-led mercantilist, as you can see here. Again, the same set of indicators now for a second period. And you see that several countries, forced by deleveraging of the private sector, forced by austerity, have moved towards this export-led mercantilist regime. Growth was very weak on average, and if there was growth, it has come from the growth of net exports, so from the balance of goods and services. And you see that, with the exception of Ireland, where we have severe accounting problems, and Ireland is a special case, and I don't have time to discuss this here, we have seen a tendency towards current account surpluses, and thus negative financial balances of the external sector. There are only France and I think Finland have remained domestic demand-led. Belgium, Greece, and Portugal have moved towards weakly export-led, which means that you either have still have a current account surplus, so negative financial balances of the external sector, but negative growth contributions of net exports, so falling current account surpluses, or you still have the positive financial balance of the external sector, meaning negative current account, but positive growth contribution of net exports, which moves you towards current account surpluses. Interestingly, this rebalancing in inverted comma our Eurozone has taken place at the expense of the rest of the world, as you can see here for the period starting in 2010. Now the Eurozone as a whole is running current account surpluses with the rest of the world. And this means, of course, severe problems, or the externalization of severe problems or with the Eurozone as a free rider of aggregate demand generated elsewhere in the world. So in total, this COVID-19 crisis has hit the Eurozone in a weak and unbalanced recovery, which now requires a return towards some sort of domestic demand-led regime if you want to be sustainable in the future. And for that purpose, we would argue that we not only have to be expansionary in the short run, as we currently are, but we have to turn towards an alternative macroeconomic policy approach. And therefore, in the next part, I would like to look a bit at Kalecki's economic policy suggestion for achieving and maintaining full employment. I don't think in this audience I have to get deeper into Kalecki's macroeconomic approach, because Robert Blacker, in a sense, has already reviewed this, and it has also contained in other presentations so far. So what we have in Kalecki is that, and that distinguishes him from Keynes, is that distribution matters. We have the profit share determined mainly by markup pricing. You usually have excess capacity, changes in demand trigger changes in utilization. We have that investment, and that has been a debate also around Malcolm's presentation and Malcolm's paper, that investment can be initially financed by credit and then generate the respective amount of saving for final finance, to use the terminology of the monetary circuit approach. Kalecki has had different types of investment functions, and he has struggled till his latest publications with improving these investment functions, as he declares in the foreword to his latest book. But generally, I think we can say that in Kalecki, investment is determined by expected demand and by internal means of finance, so the idea of the principle of increasing risk. We have the paradox of thrift, as in all Keynesian, post-Keynesian models. We also have in Kalecki the idea that demand is wage-led, so that a redistribution in favor of profits will usually depress at least domestic demand. Things might turn or might change if we include the effect on net exports. And we have the government deficit expenditures as well as export surpluses are able to raise equilibrium aggregate demand and the volume of profits, as you know from Kalecki's profit equation. Now, looking at Kalecki's contributions in the first half of the 1940s, and Malcolm, I think, has done this more in detail, we focus in particular on two papers, on the 3 ways to full employment and then on the political aspects of full employment. And as is well known in this audience, in 3 ways to full employment, Kalecki discusses 3 options to reach and maintain full employment. The first is government deficit spending, in particular on public investment or on the subsidies of mass consumption. The second one is the stimulation of private investment through reductions in interest rates or through lowering income taxes. And the third one is the redistribution of income from higher to low income classes. The second way, stimulating private investment, is discarded because the immediate effect depends on the decision of the capitalist, which are quite uncertain and may not generate the expected results, in particular in deep recessions with depressed expectations. And if they are successful, Kalecki argues, then the capacity of effective investment will kick in and will require further cuts in interest rates or taxes, and this obviously has a limit. And therefore, Kalecki is proposing this combination of the first and the third way, so government deficit spending and income distribution. Regarding the first, government deficit spending, he explains that there will not be any crowding out if there are still unemployed resources, first condition, and the second condition, if interest rates are kept low. Government deficits finance itself in a double sense. So the first, it means that they, of course, increase income and therefore tax revenues. And the remaining budget deficit is also financed by the increase in income, as you can see here. So at the end of the day, based on national accounting, investment and the government deficit generate the required amount, or the amount of saving. And here you have the quote by Kalecki on this. If this additional saving created by the private sector is not creating demand for government bonds, but rather for liquidity and imposes an upward pressure on interest rates, and therefore on interest rates and government bonds, Kalecki argues that is where bank policies or the central bank has to step in. And here's the quote: "The rate of interest may be maintained at a stable level, however large the budget deficit, given proper banking policy." So that is where I think Kalecki already comes up with the idea of low interest rate policies in order to support the government in running fiscal deficits to stabilize the economy. Malcolm has already talked about the national debt, and I'm just repeating this here. So for the economy as a whole, the national debt cannot be a burden. What for me was still a bit unclear, and maybe we can get into that into the discussion, is why he discusses taxes to finance interest payments, because if the rate of interest is kept low, there are no taxes required in order to finance interest payments if you have a growing economy. But if you want to finance your interest payments by taxes, then he argues that you should go for taxes on wealth, financial, and real assets. Government deficits always finds a limit when the scarcity of labor or the scarcity or full employment, full utilization of the capital stock will emerge, and we reach a kind of full utilization inflation barrier. He argues that in this case, in order to avoid inflation, the government must therefore be careful not to push their deficit spending beyond the mark indicated by full utilization of labor and equipment. If the capital stock is too low, then the focus of government activities should be on expanding productive capacities. I will come back to that later. When full employment is reached, he argues that nominal wages should not rise faster than productivity in order to avoid rising inflation. Again, I will pick up this idea later on as well. Real wages, in a sense, should thus rise with labor productivity. He also argues or highlights the stabilizing role of government deficit spending for private investment and for cyclical fluctuations. Interestingly, regarding private investment, he argues that it must be kept, and quote, private investment must be at a level adequate to expand the capacity of equipment pari passu with the increase in working population and productivity of labor proportional to full employment output. Regarding the type of government investment, Kalecki argues that it should be guided by social priorities and therefore should not exclusively be focused on public investment, but it should also include public consumption and subsidies, private consumption. Finally, he argues that these government expenditures should then be complemented by a redistribution of income, shifting income to low-income households with a higher propensity to consume. For that purpose, he advocates a progressive taxation, and he proposes a modified income tax, which is clarified a bit more in an earlier publication, exempting reinvested profits from progressive taxation, or alternatively a wealth tax on financial and real assets. Distribution of redistribution of primary income distribution can also be achieved by real wages growing faster than productivity, but this finds its limit when we have reached full employment and full utilization of productive capacities. If you then want to redistribute income, you have to limit the income claims of other groups in society by taxes on profits or by price controls, he argues. In an earlier paper, and Malcolm has also referred to that, and has also, also have discussed this before, in Political Aspects of Full Employment, he is well aware that although there is the program, or there is this, well, there are these two ways to achieve full employment. In a capitalist system, you usually will not, at least not persistently so, introduce that because of the resistance of the ruling class, and in particular, the economic experts, as he calls them, of the ruling class. The ruling class closely connected with banking and industry, or the experts closely connected with the banking and industry as the ruling class. And this is so, although government deficit spending will raise profits. Malcolm, I think, has already referred to the quote, which you also see here. He basically presents three arguments why the experts of banking and industries are against permanent full employment, dislike of government interference with the problem of employment as such, dislike of the direction of government spending, so public investment and subsidizing consumption, and the dislike of the social and political changes resulting from the maintenance of full employment. However, interesting in that paper, Kalecki also concedes that in post-war economies, and I would add, or in deep recessions as the one which we're currently facing, those experts accept government's responsibility for full employment, but only under certain conditions. So first, they would recommend the stimulus of private investment through interest rate and tax cuts. If this finds its limits, as we currently observe, then of course they also accept government expenditure or government deficit expenditure, but it should then focus on investment and not on consumption. And second, they would insist that the measures should be confined to the slump and would resist permanent public deficit spending to sustain full employment. While thinking about this presentation, the famous TTT recommendation, which came to my mind, which I think it was put forward by people around the IMF in the course of the latest crisis, so that government expenditures or government deficit expenditures should be timely, targeted, and temporary. I think Kalecki already had that. From Kalecki's perspective, this then gives rise to stop-and-go policy and to what he calls a political business cycle. And in a sense, Malcolm has already referred to that for the case of Great Britain. You could also view, in a sense, the European responses after the latest crisis under this perspective, although it was also triggered, I would say, by the institutional deficiencies built in the economic policy institutions, or the specific economic policy institution of the Eurozone. Kalecki further argues that full employment capitalism will have to develop new social and political institutions which reflect the increased power of the working class and requires fundamental reform. But he remains pretty vague in this paper, and also in the joint paper with Kowalik, on what exactly fundamental reform means. I mean, Kowalik, in a later contribution to a book, argued, well, Kalecki would most probably say that the essence of crucial reform was successful governance of overall demand. When crucial reform is reversed, as in the late 70s, early 80s, with the liberalization of labor and financial markets, and then the monetarist turn of macroeconomic policies, stagnation tendencies and high unemployment are back on the agenda, and they have stayed there since then. Joseph Steindl, whose work I admire a whole lot, has used Kalecki's idea of a political business cycle, and then called this tendency since the mid-late 1970s stagnation policy, or stagnation as a political trend. Okay, so this is Kalecki. Now, what can we make of Kalecki if we want to apply his ideas to the Eurozone? I would argue that Kalecki's full employment policy proposal from the 1940s implies a macroeconomic policy mix which has inspired several modern post-Keynesian macroeconomists, and which has also been applied by these macroeconomists, among them, again, Philip Orestes and Malcolm Sawyer, Engelbert Starkhammer, myself, and others. And this policy mix would have, or should have, four main pillars, four main ingredients. First of all, we would need a kind of functional finance fiscal policy to generate and stabilize full employment, which could be or should be accompanied by progressive taxation for distributional and stabilization purposes. Monetary policy would have to guarantee public debt of member countries, and it would have to guarantee or target low long-term interest rates. On top of that, you could argue, but Kalecki, I think, at least to my knowledge, is not very explicit about that, that the monetary authorities would also have to take care of financial stability. Wage and incomes policies should provide stable inflation when we reach full employment. Of course, you always have some effects on income distribution as well. On top of that, you also need industrial and regional policies to overcome supply side constraints, which are given by the capital stock and by the human capacities, in particular, of course, in the periphery of the Eurozone. For this policy package, coordination is important, coordination both vertically of national as well as European institutions within the respective policy area, in particular in the area of fiscal policy and wage policies. And you need horizontal coordination among the different policy areas. So horizontal coordination between fiscal, monetary, and wage policies in the way which I have outlined based on Kalecki. So you would need a coordinated way of aggregate demand management linked with industrial and regional policies. The question is, and now we turn a bit more realistic in the sense, or applied, can we do that in the current institutional framework? And here I would argue, well, at least some institutions are there. Of course, their content would have to be changed. So we have the macroeconomic dialogue for the horizontal coordination. We have the European semester as the economic policy program, if you like. And we even have institutions for financing regional and industrial policies like the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund. And we even have now established, although only at an infant stage, new institutions as a response towards the COVID-19 crisis. Now, what does that mean? How much time have I left? Well, I still have 5 minutes or so. What does that mean in particular? Well, for fiscal policy, and you have seen a similar equation also from Malcolm in Malcolm's presentation, for fiscal policy, it means that for each of the member countries, we need government deficits mopping up or taking up the excess of private saving over private investment at full employment. So this is basically Lerner's idea of functional finance, which can also be found in Kalecki. As Malcolm has already shown to you, this means that you run towards a definite debt to GDP ratio, and provided that, that's the equation 7, provided that the rate of interest is lower than the GDP growth rate, you can even afford primary deficits without having to use tax revenues to service your debt. In a sense, what you could argue is that from a Kaleckian post-Keynesian perspective, you need a kind of rule, or at least guideline for government deficits, which I try to summarize here in equation 8, which says that you need a long-run government deficit which maintains full employment in the long run, or you might need a surplus in case your private investment exceeds private saving at full employment. And then you need a short-run reaction towards shocks whenever GDP is falling below your target GDP at full employment. On top of that, the usual recommendations by Kalecki for taxations. We would argue that this kind of rule or guideline for each country, what could be coordinated, let's say, by the European Commission in the course of the European semester, in a way that it sums up towards a deficit or surplus for the Eurozone as a whole, which generates the full. For practical reasons, we have already in earlier publications argued that you should really, for this coordination of policies, and that goes beyond Kalecki, of course, you should look at government expenditures and should define government expenditure paths, which at least on average over the trade cycle would then generate the required government deficit given your national tax rates, etc. This would have to be amended by European industrial and regional policies because in particular in the periphery, you have severe constraints regarding the capital stock. You have severe problems of, in particular, non-price competitiveness. If you, in the course of such a policy approach, want to avoid the current account deficits within the Eurozone, which we have seen before, and therefore you would have to link these macroeconomic stabilization policies with adequate industrial and regional policies, which improve the capital stock in the periphery. You can also argue that for the Eurozone as a whole, if you want the periphery to catch up with the center, if you want the periphery to catch up with Germany or whatever you have, there's a potential of the periphery. Well, the periphery has to grow faster than the center. And this, everything else constant, would drive the periphery again into current account deficits. Now, we would argue that if this catching up process is sustainable, then you could allow for that. And this would mean that you have to modify your requirement here for the government deficit, both in the center and in the periphery, which means that the deficit in the periphery could be somewhat higher than allowed here, and the deficit in the center could be somewhat lower. Provided that you have a sustainable catching up process, and for that you need further conditions. So you have to make sure that the financial deficits of the periphery are used for sustainable catching up. So you have to avoid bubble growth as you have seen it in the early 2000s. And that is, I think, where a regional and industrial policy comes in, and where you also have a role for the European Investment Bank, the European Investment Funds, etc. For monetary policy in the Eurozone, it means that the ECB has to continue with its policies of low interest rates. We would argue that the ECB should even go one step further, or move one step further. It should unconditionally guarantee the government debt of the member countries, which just means to announce that it will intervene into secondary government bonds markets as soon as the rate of interest for a specific country exceeds the rate of growth of its GDP, either nominal or real. So this means that this is the rule, so to speak. So you would have the ECB would, in a sense, put a cap on the long-term rate of interest for each country, such that this long-term nominal rate of interest is equal or slightly higher than the rate of inflation, but lower than the nominal rate of GDP growth, composed of the real GDP growth plus the rate of inflation. For wage and income policy, you would have the usual recommendation of nominal wages growing at a rate of labor productivity growth plus the target rate of inflation in the respective country. Of course, for that purpose, you need to re-regulate labor markets, empower trade unions and employer associations. Currently, we're having a debate about euro area minimum wages. I think this could be a tool which can be applied here to put a floor to the wage developments, and then to increase this minimum wage in each country according to the rule, which you see in equation 10, and which would then lift the whole structure of wages. We have time for the conclusions. Well, if I don't get a no, then I just go on. In the paper, so we have argued that this COVID-19 crisis had hit the Eurozone in a very fragile situation, with a weak and asymmetric recovery from the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, and the Eurozone crisis. We have argued that these crises have revealed the weaknesses of the macroeconomic policy institutions of the Eurozone, which is based on new consensus macroeconomics. We have illustrated these weaknesses using the notion of macroeconomic regimes. We have shown the internal imbalances in the first period, so the run-up to these crises. with the polarization of the current account deficit debt-led private demand boom countries on the one hand, and the current account surplus export-led mercantilist countries on the other hand. We have also shown that these internal imbalances have been externalized in the second period, so from 2010 to 2019. The Eurozone as a whole and most of the core Eurozone countries have turned export-led mercantilist, creating a problem for the global economy. We've seen a weak recovery from these previous crises, and we've seen a high vulnerability, so to speak, of the Eurozone for in the case of global recessions. And I've just looked into I've looked into the IMF forecast, and if you look at that, you see that the Eurozone is the region in the world which is hit most by the COVID-19 crisis, according to the forecast of the IMF. We have shown that an alternative to the new consensus model and to the export-led mercantilist regime generated by this policy approach can be found in Kalecki's full employment policy suggestions. So we need, according to that, we need a combination of government deficit expenditures with redistribution policies in favor of labor and low-income households, which has to be or should be assisted by central banks targeting low interest rates. We have outlined this policy mix of functional finance, fiscal policy, low interest rate targeting monetary policy, and inflation stabilizing wage and income policies linked with regional and industrial policies, also contained in Kalecki, to improve sustainable catching up and recovery for the Eurozone. This policy, at least in our view, could contribute to a more rapid recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and also to a medium to long run non-inflationary full employment domestic demand regime on the one hand, and also internally to a sustainable catching up of the periphery of the Eurozone with respect to the more mature center. Whether the implementation of such a policy mix would be equivalent to a crucial reform in the sense of Kalecki and Kowalik may need further discussion. Thank you very much, and apologies for going a bit over time.
Thank you, Professor Hein. I think that this subject is interesting for the moment. Now, does the interesting can go to the chat box and raise their hands for question. I have Jerry Corbisanos. Please, por favor.
Thank you. Hello, Eckhard. Haven't seen you a long time since Barcelona, Bilbao.
Yeah, hi, Jerry. Good to see you.
Now, I have three questions. Two are very quick. The second one will take a bit longer. First of all, excellent. I find from an Australian perspective, a lot of what you're saying from a policy perspective can be applied to advanced economies outside of the Eurozone. So I think it's excellent work, and you summarised, especially given the COVID, very well. But three questions. One is more of a Euro-centric one. It's a hypothetical. Has the Brexit made the Eurozone situation and its fragility less fragile or more fragile? It's just from a curious one. The gut of my question, the significant one, is taking up your crucial reform for discussion last point, because I noticed a lot of reactive policies there, all of them aimed at reacting to what the capitalists are doing, and the TTT and all this temporary stuff, and always going back to the market's ruling. And the public expenditure is going to keep spending and spending, but in the end, the markets are ruling. Occasionally you talk about guided by social priorities. Occasionally you talk about coordination, which I squint at, because I know in Australia, governments, the way they're structured, coordination is passing the buck, basically. What I think we need is the broad palette of Kalecki's work, which I talked about yesterday. We need, and I think, and this is my question, do we need something to counter the political business cycle, and to have a significant planning structure that is proactive, that sets within there all those effective policies that you're saying, because without it, I think we're wasting our time. It's essentially the capitalists are going to take it over and they push it back. So I think we need a short-term planning horizon linked with some long-term objectives that can and it's the perfect time. COVID has effectively made governments the planning instrument because they have to. So I think, except for the US, planning has come back in because it's necessary when everything else is not working, because the markets are not working, because they're stopped. So governments are planning. This is the perfect time to bring planning in. That's my view. What's yours? Third, isn't catching up for the perspective of the peripheral, and I read a lot from my home country of Greece. Catching up, all the research I've shown is pure chimera. There's never, all the research I've shown is no hope of catching up, especially under current structures. So anybody talking about catching up, to me, it's a chimera. Nothing will bring about catching up unless you change the crucial reforms of how the Eurozone's going.
Yeah. Answer. Okay. Maybe I take it from the back. So I agree. I mean, a sustainable catching up requires these reforms, which incompletely so I tried to list, and which I think, at least, although Kalecki himself is not very specific, but if they allow us to generate full employment for the medium to long run, then it would be equivalent to what Kowalik argues is Kalecki's understanding of crucial reform. So that's still very vague. But I don't think that we get a sustainable catching up without structural changes in the policy model. And one important feature of these structural changes, in my view, is, although I know it's very difficult to implement, and there are not so many success stories, is regional and industrial policies. I mean, there's no way around that. I mean, in a sense, we have seen catching up, if you look at macro numbers, in Greece, in Spain, in Ireland, in the period from 1999 till 2007, 2008. So their GDP growth, their per capita growth has been much higher than in the center. That's catching up, but it was not sustainable. It was bubble growth, as we call it. And so this is something you have to avoid. For this, you need the proper institution. So that is clear. Now, this links up with your second question, which also, I think, yeah, the government is back. It's back in a double sense, I would say. On the one hand, it's back because it's now accepted, and interestingly, that's also in Kalecki 1943. It's accepted in deep recession that the government plays a role. And this is still the ambiguity, or I see in what's going on in the Eurozone, because I didn't mention that in the presentation explicitly, because we also have this idea that we need the ecological transition, that we need a Green Deal, or that we have a Green Deal, which is incomplete, which is focusing too much on markets, gives too less a role for the government. Exactly. Yeah. Although I tend to be very pessimistic, I would also argue, well, this is something we can argue about. This is something where the ideas which Kaleckians, post-Keynesians come up with now can be linked with what's going on in the public debate, and which is what's also proposed by more orthodox economists. But of course, it's a major step to get what Kalecki has in mind. So it means a major institutional reforms, and for that you need, and that's my last remark to these two questions, you need a change in the power relationship. So and this is open, it's speculation. You might see indications.
I'm just worried if you do the other things, they're just going to be lost once the markets take over.
Yeah, okay. That's also what I fear. I mean, in my introduction, I have to be, well, on the one hand, I see that there are these measures, these new institutions, but on the other hand, I also see that there is the promise to pay back the debt in the future. So there is no sense for a permanent government deficit, permanent government debt in order to stabilize the economy. That's the macro side. And on the institutional side, of course, there is still the idea that the markets have the final say, but governments might push them. So there is the idea that we need some initial finance, not in the monetary circuit sense, but that we need some government push, and then the markets will do that. I think this idea is not yet overcome, and it's a lot of well, political debate, political pressure, power relationships, which has to enforce that. And of course, for this, we can only point out the problems, but we can't solve this. I mean, this has to be done by real-world politics, and we can only provide the contradictions, or a view on the current contradictions and on alternatives. And of course, as political economists, we are involved in that, but that's nothing we can, as such, can solve. Regarding your first question, I don't know. I mean, it is more harmful for Britain than for the EU. That is for sure. I think economically, it is not that big a problem for the EU, but politically, it's a big problem. And I think that is the whole current debate. I mean, the whole current debate is around what are the conditions under which you can leave the EU. That this might have an impact.
Okay, thank you. Go to Joel Leclerc. Dude.
Able to hear me. Can you hear me or no?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry, I can't show my video right now because I'm joining with my whole class, and I think my computer is like too many people at the same time. But anyways, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really exciting to share that with my class today. So the students and me from my money and banking class are interested in knowing, so now with COVID-19 and everything, what's it going to take? Do you think that this is going to be enough of a crisis for the government to go ahead and implement like a Green New Deal, and maybe for people to push for a jobs program? Do you think it's going to be a permanent jobs program? If they do, like, do you think this is enough of a crisis to bring us to the place that we've been talking about as something that we desire? So I guess I wanted your opinion on that, and for myself and also for my students. So thank you.
Yeah, I guess I have to frustrate you saying, I don't know. I mean, it's the same answer as to Jerry. I mean, this is what the political processes of the next couple of years maybe will show. I see some indication that there is now an acceptance of the role of the state, an acceptance of the role of the public sector, in particular the health sector, but also other public provisions. But whether it will lead us to a job guarantee program, I don't see that for the EU or the Eurozone. And we have this Green Deal in the EU, but as I already mentioned, this is severely limited, and it still provides too little a role for the government. So it still relies too much on market incentives, etc. So this will be a result of the political struggles in the years to come. And sometimes I'm optimistic, sometimes I'm pessimistic. I'm sorry that I cannot provide a more definite answer to that.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Go to Sam Levy.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering if I could press you for details on coordination of fiscal policy a little bit, because it strikes me that it's this very difficult thing to do. It strikes me that there's some strategic or incentive problems involved. For instance, if in the whole region aggregate demand is too high and things are heating up and there's some inflation and we want to turn to fiscal policy to deal with that in the common currency, then there's like a difficult question to answer of which country is the one that cuts spending, right? Or if spending needs to be cut across the board, how does it get distributed across the countries? And if mechanisms to answer questions like that aren't built into the institutional structure for the coordination system, then it strikes me that it's going to eventually fall apart when nations aren't acting in good faith. You know, when tensions are high at some point in the future, then you could get maybe some sort of runaway inflation kind of thing. So can you comment on that?
I agree. I mean, you have this coordination problem is maybe the most severe problem we're facing in the EU and in the Eurozone. And it didn't work before or from 1999 till the financial crisis and the Great Recession, because you had applying the rule which I have suggested would have meant, for instance, for countries like Spain, running a lower budget deficit or even a budget surplus. And this is, of course, difficult to implement, difficult to enforce. For this purpose, of course, we should prefer a centralized or a full federal budget for the EU, which could be used for these stabilization purposes. There are some colleagues who are suggesting that. My colleague Jörg Bibo, for instance, Skidmore College, is strongly in favor of going for a European budget because, among other things, of this coordination problem. However, my view is that, well, this is even less likely given the political circumstances. So to give up parts of your budget in favor of a European budget is very difficult to get through politically in the member countries. And that is the reason why I was thinking about, not only me, others are thinking about how can we coordinate national fiscal policies in a sensible way. The problem we've seen so far is that the coordination focus has been the one-size-fits-all budget deficit rule. So 3% for the current budget and the 0% or even a slight surplus for the structural budget. And I would argue that this is the wrong target, because this is difficult to control for governments, in particular if you look at the current budget. And therefore, we have proposed, and I only have slightly indicated that in the presentation in the current paper, but in the paper you'll find references to our other work. We have proposed to focus on expenditure paths. So instead of focusing on deficits, we focused the coordination on those tools or instruments which governments indeed can control. And what they can control is their non-cyclical expenditures, and to use that as a coordination tool. So this is at least avoids one problem of coordination. And then, of course, you still have the problems, even if you have a proper tool or proper instrument which you coordinate, will governments follow the guidelines for coordination? And for that, you then would need sanctions. And then you have the whole lot of political economy problems which are related to that. But I agree there are serious incentive problems, but in the incomplete institutional setting which we are facing, there would be an alternative way, at least solving one of the problems.
Thank you.
No. You have other questions, sir?
No.
No. Okay. Thanks, dear Eckhard. How do you say, interesting the topics, and interesting your proposal, policy for European countries. Thank you.
One moment, there is a question, last minute question by Robert Blecker. Robert, go ahead. Robert?
There's also a question in the chat by Dava Sharpa. Do you think process EU running persistent current account surpluses can have contractual impact on global aggregate demand and hinders the global recovery? My answer is yes. That's one of the problems we're facing. So the EU or the Eurozone in our data set is a drag on world demand, is a free rider on world demand, and creates global imbalances. It creates problems for global recovery. And it also creates political problems. I mean, I don't have to point this out here. I mean, there is a bit of truth in Trump's foreign economic policy. I mean, and the bit of truth is that we have a high imbalance between the EU or the Eurozone and the US in terms of the current account. And for this, also EU macroeconomic policies are partly responsible, as I've outlined.
Thank you, Eckhard. Robert, do you have a question?
Well, it actually follows, can you all hear me now? Yeah, okay. So this actually follows on what Dava was asking about. I was thinking along the same lines, and you focused on the European case, and there's certainly enough challenges there to find any kind of cooperation. But as your response says, we need to think about this also in a global scale. While you were speaking, I looked up some of the figures, and while the European surpluses have been growing, so have the deficits in a number of regions, including Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. The Asian surpluses have shrunk, although that's probably very uneven by country. Even the Middle East has swung from large surpluses to large deficits. So we have another global imbalances problem that's a little bit different from what it was 10 or 15 years ago. But now in the context of a real risk of a prolonged global depression, and bringing us back to sort of Joan Robinson talking about the protectionist battles of the 1930s, in her theory of employment, because we see the U.S. trade war with China, we see Brexit, and they're not isolated examples, they're the big examples, but there's many cases of countries pursuing nationalistic policies. And while we post-Keynesians and Kaleckians have never been ardent free traders, I don't think we are sort of pure nationalists either. I think we want a different kind of international cooperation. And so, this is not at all a criticism of what you did, which I think is brilliant, but there's a need to complement this with a more global analysis of what kind of international cooperation we need now to avoid we're in a global slump, but to avoid a prolonged depression. And if Trump wins, well, the United States is just a bad actor, and there's not going to be any cooperation. But even if Biden wins, we know that he will be pushed from different sides. The progressive forces pushing for something like a Green New Deal and thinking big and being another Franklin Roosevelt, and the more traditional forces, even within the Democratic Party, the Clintonoid forces pushing toward austerity and shrinking the budget deficit or just going small on things where he needs to go big. So I know you can't answer all this right now, but I think all of us should put it on our agenda to work on sort of the global ramifications of all this in the present circumstances.
Well, I agree, Robert, with what you're saying. I mean, I have analyzed the period after the Great Recession as a period in which these imbalances by these, what I call the debt-led private demand boom and the export-led mercantilist countries, have been replaced by an imbalance. On the one hand, we still have these export-led mercantilist regimes, now the whole Eurozone. And on the other hand, we now have some countries which still have control over their currency and therefore can allow for high government stabilization, government deficits like the US and the UK. So domestic demand-led regimes, as I call them, stabilized by government deficits. And then we have had the emerging market economies in which we still have seen a buildup of private debt together with government debt. And now in this crisis, this house of cards is collapsing again. We see these capital flows out of the emerging market countries, which, I mean, the colleagues from Brazil, Argentina, and Turkey can I think tell stories about that. And now this is collapsing. So now the question is, what is next? And I think the guideline is what I still try to outline here for the Eurozone is that we have to go for some. I prefer an income-led recovery instead of a wage-led recovery, because I think wage-led, although I've used this terminology in the past myself, is a bit misleading because I think it puts too much into this redistribution issue, arguing that, well, if we have to redistribute in favor of labor and that will then stimulate aggregate demand. I think this is what all the numbers tell us is it won't be harmful, but it won't do the trick. And so we need a sort of domestic demand-led recovery with, and now, well, the core of my presentation found in Kalecki, with a significant role of the government, with a significant role of government deficits, in particular in those countries which still have control over their currency. And the Eurozone will have to develop towards that. So this is, I think, the specific condition in the Eurozone, but in those countries which have control over the currency and which can follow this kind of policies, and by means of that can contribute to rebalance and allow those countries which are catching up to do so without running into too severe current or foreign debt problems. I think that is the global strategy, or the framework for a global strategy. Now ask me for the institutions. Wow, this is again the difficult question. But in a sense, I mean, that's Keynes' idea of a clearing union. I mean, and Kalecki also had similar ideas with Schumacher. But well, we would have to specify this for the current circumstances and the current conditions, and I think that's the difficult task.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? In that case, we are pretty much right on time, 1 minute short. Thank you very much, Eckhard. Just so everyone knows, these papers will be published in an upcoming issue of the Review of Political Economy. And as well, the presentations, provided authors give us permission, will be posted on the website of the Lipinski Foundation.